All right, guys, so this evening we're going to pick up in Daniel chapter 8, and we're going to talk about the little horn again. Now, before we get started, you're going to hear me reference a couple of books that you're probably not used to hearing about, and those are called 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And right here in my hand, I have a copy of what's called the Apocrypha. This just happens to be the Apocrypha from the King James Version Bible. It was originally in the King James Bible. I have a King James. It's from the early 1800s, middle 1800s, sitting here in my living room. Great big pulpit Bible, and it actually has the Apocrypha still in it. Now, the books in this are not canonized. They are not scripture. Just everybody get that in your mind. The books in the Apocrypha are not inspired. There are some faiths that feel that the books in the Apocrypha are. I don't suggest anybody spend a whole lot of time reading it, because just basically as soon as you start reading it, you can tell that these books don't line up with Scripture, most of them. But there are a couple of books in here called 1st and 2nd Maccabees, and they are even when we were studying Daniel in school, they will reference 1st and 2nd Maccabees, not as holding them to Scripture, not saying they're Scripture, but they're very good Jewish historical writings, and that's all they are. They're just Jewish historical writings that talk about the period in between the Old and the New Testament, and it gives us some real insight on what's going on tonight. So you can, like I said, I picked this one up off of like Amazon for $13, and it's this little book with really small, hard to read print. And the only reason I bought it is because I didn't want to buy a whole Bible with the Apocrypha in it, because I knew I wasn't going to use it other than for historical studies. So anyway, if you want to go in and check this out, like I said, you can check out 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They're good history. It's not inspired. And I don't suggest you waste any of your time reading the other books in the Apocrypha. That being said, that's my sources. That's one of my sources. But anyway, so Daniel chapter 8. We're going to talk about a little horn again. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that had appeared to me earlier. And I saw the vision, and as I watched, I was in the fortress city of Susa, in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was beside the Ulai Canal. I looked up, and there was a ram standing beside the canal, and he had 2 horns. 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, and the other one came up last. I saw the ram charging to the west, the north, the south. No animal could stand against him, and there was no rescue from his power. He did whatever he wanted to and became great. And as I was observing, a male goat appeared and came from the west across the surface of the entire earth without touching the ground. And the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. And he came forward, and the 2-horned ram I had seen standing beside the canal rushed at him with savage fury. I saw him approaching the ram, and infuriated with him, struck the ram, breaking his 2 horns. The ram was not strong enough to stand against him, and the goat threw him to the ground and trampled him. And there was no one to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat acted even more arrogantly, but when he became powerful, the large horn was broken, and 4 conspicuous horns came up in its place, pointing toward the 4 winds of heaven. From one of them, a little horn emerged, and it grew extensively toward the south, the east, and towards the beautiful land. It grew high as the heavenly army, and made some of the army of the stars fall to the earth and trampled them. It acted arrogantly, even against the prince of the heavenly army, and it revoked his regular sacrifice and overthrew the place of his sanctuary. In the rebellion, the army was given up together with the regular sacrifice, and the horn threw truth to the ground and was successful in what it did. Then I heard the Holy One speaking, and another Holy One said to the speaker, "How long will the events of this vision last? The regular sacrifice, the rebellion that makes desolate, and give over the sanctuary of the army to be trampled." He said to me, "For 2,300 evenings, evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be restored." Now while I, Daniel, was watching the vision, trying to understand it, there stood before me someone who appeared to be a man. And I heard a human voice calling from the middle of the Ual, "Gabriel, explain the vision of this man." So he approached where I was standing when he came near, and I was terrified and fell face down. "Son of man," he said, "understand what the vision refers to the time of the end. While he was speaking to me, I fell into a deep sleep and my face to the ground. Then he touched me and made me stand up and said, I am here to tell you what will happen from the conclusion of time of wrath, because it refers to the appointed time of the end. The two-horned ram that you saw represents the king of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat represents the king of Greece, and the large horn between his eyes represents the first king. The four horns that took the place of the broken horn represent four kingdoms, and they will rise from that nation, but without its power. Near the end of their kingdoms, when the rebels have reached the full measure of their sin, a ruthless king, skilled in intrigue, will come to the throne, and his power will be great, but it will not be his own. He will cause outrageous destruction and succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the powerful along with the holy people, and he will cause deceit to prosper through his cunning and by his influence. In his own mind he will exalt himself. He will destroy many in a time of peace, and he will even stand against the prince of princes. Yet he will be broken not by human hands. The vision of the evening and the morning that had been told me. Now you are to seal up the vision, because it refers to many days in the future. I, Daniel, was overcome and lay sick for days, and I got up and went about the king's business, and I was greatly disturbed by the vision and could not understand it. So, this takes place, it says, in the third year of Belshazzar's reign, which would be approximately 550 BC. Now, if Daniel was a teenager or in his early teens at the time of his capture and his banishment to Babylon, sorry, the dog's squeaking a toy, it's kind of catching me. Then he would be around in his 70s at this time. So Daniel's an old man, and he's coming towards the end of his life. And it's been a while. If you read, it's been a while since Daniel has kind of, had a vision, or it's not like Daniel just stands around and has visions. We get this idea that Daniel's this guy who just kind of stands around, has a vision, and reports on it. This is something, most of the time when Daniel is telling us about something, it's something that's a vision that someone else has had, or it's a dream, but this is the first real vision that Daniel has. Before he had a dream in the last chapter, and it disturbed him pretty heavily. Now, just like this dream disturbed him, Becky's dog is disturbing me. So, the Antichrist may be living in my house, and it's a poodle.
You're going to lay sick for days.
But anyway, so Daniel's disturbed by this. Like we talked about last week, when people talk about prophesying and stuff, this is Daniel. This is a guy that even Ezekiel talks about being, somebody that God is made very great, with great knowledge, and he's so disturbed by this, he lays sick for days. So the ram here that we picture is it says in verse 20, this ram is, it's got one large horn and one horn that's large as well, but not quite as large. So, if we look back over at Daniel chapter 7, which we just left, this is a good comparison to the bear that we see over there. One side's raised up higher than the other. One side's more powerful than the other, which would be the Medo-Persian Empire, which is soon to come in Daniel's life here. But the Persians or in this confederation, are more powerful than the Medes. So that God kind of stays with that metaphor that one side's greater than the other. And next we have the goat. Oh, come on, computer. Everything's against me tonight. So, the goat. The goat, we're told in verse 21, with the large horn is the Greek Empire. Now, that large horn, of course, as we know, is Alexander the Great. He is the large and powerful horn that is of the Greek Empire. Now, a little side note about this big goat that we see here with the one powerful horn is that in Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, records the story of how Alexander the Great, 200 years after this prophecy, after Daniel receives this prophecy, 200 years later, Alexander the Great comes marching towards Egypt. And he is trying to conquer everything in his sight. Well, the next thing on his list, while he is conquering the Medo-Persian Empire and headed towards Egypt to take it over, is Israel. It's Judea. So he comes out to the gates outside of Judah, and the high priest walks out. in his priestly robes, all decked out. And there's been some things going back and forth here, some troublemaking by the Samaritans, which are, you'll read it in the New Testament, are like the arch enemies of the Jewish people. They're a mixed race of Jewish, and anyway, they're kind of, their religion is very clouded and has some weird things going on. So them and the Jews don't get along. They've started a little bit of trouble, and they've kind of egged on Alexander the Great to really destroy Jerusalem. So the high priest walks out, and he has the scroll of Daniel in his hand, and he's dressed in his big fancy breastplate with the jewels on it, his crown and turban, his priestly ephod, and he walks out, and he opens the scroll of Daniel to Alexander, and he reads him what we know today. There were no chapters then, but he reads to him what we know today is chapter 8. And when he gets to the goat, he says, Alexander, you are the goat. You are the great horn growing from this goat. You're moving so fast, conquering the earth so fast, just like this goat, you don't touch the ground. Your speed and your power crushes everything in front of you. And see here, you destroy the Medo-Persian Empire. You are the end of the Medo-Persian Empire, who he's at war with. And Alexander says, you're not going to believe this, but I had a dream that some dude dressed just like you came out and told me that I was going to win whether I was going to win the battle or not. And so he, right then and there, he has his mind, because the Samaritan enclaves are with him, and he has it in his mind when he walks into Jerusalem that he's going to destroy it. But instead they open the gates to him, come out, kind of celebrate him, make a bunch of pomp and circumstance because he's there, and proclaim that he is going to conquer the empire that they're now ruled by. So guess what? He makes a treaty with them. And for the next several hundred years, the Jews kind of enjoy favor from the Greek Empire, even after, for generation upon generation after Alexander dies, because of this prophecy in chapter 8. Now, the bad part is the bad part in chapter 8, because it's not always been good with the Greeks. So they, I think it's 7 generations after Alexander the Great, things go pretty good. But we know that there are the 4 horns. The big horn is it goes away, and 4 horns take its place, which are the 4 generals that took over ruling Alexander's kingdom that he built after he died young at the age of 32. And all of a sudden we have this little horn. Now, how many people, don't raise your hands, how many people here after last week, after we studied the little horn, who was the allusion to the Antichrist, how many people here see little horn and think Antichrist? You'd be exactly wrong. Okay, because just because there are 2 little horns here in chapter 7, the little horn which is the Antichrist and the little horn which is coming out of the Greek Empire, does not mean they're both the same. So the differences in the little horns, number one, they have a much different origin. We see that the little horn in chapter 7, rises out of the revived Roman Empire. So it comes from a totally different lineage. It's from that last kingdom. And we've seen through chapters 4 and chapter 7 that there's going to be really 4 empires that surround, 4 or 5 empires that surround Israel and the Holy Land. And this Greek Empire is the 3rd one. And so it comes from a different background, comes from a different empire. And there's also, we talk about the lengths of persecution. So last week we talked about in Daniel and in Revelation that 3.5 years is the time of the Great Tribulation. So here it says that the time of tribulation is going to be, 2,300 days, which comes out not to 3.5 years, but for 6.25 years. So different times of persecution. So this is not the Antichrist that they are talking about, that Daniel's talking about, that God is revealing to him. Now, that being said, you probably heard in there where it said twice that this has to do with revealing the end, correct? So if this is not the Antichrist, why is this little horn referred to as revealing of the end. And we will see that more as we go on when we start seeing, especially in chapter 11, we'll see how this really ties in. But this horn that we're looking at now, God kind of gives a warning. And that warning comes through a guy named Antiochus Epiphanes. And he is once the Greek kingdom splits up, once the Greek Empire splits into 4 kingdoms, there will be 7 rulers that come. And the 8th one is Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Epiphanes means manifest of God, or God manifested. In other words, Epiphanes means, I think I'm God. It has to do all about him being somehow, some way deity, like a demigod, I guess you would say. But Antiochus Epiphanes, they gave him a nickname, and it was a wordplay, and I can't pronounce what the word was. But the wordplay was very similar to Epiphanes, but it meant madman, because this guy was crazy. They say it was as dangerous to be a relative of Antiochus Epiphanes as it was to be an enemy of Antiochus Epiphanes. Anyone that he thought could get power from him had a claim to his power. It didn't matter. So we see that it says that he will gain power, and his power won't be his own, and he'll be a man of intrigue and all these things. He actually gains power because he is the second in line for the throne. And in the treaty that the Greek kingdom had with the Republic of Rome at this time, it's before Rome was a huge empire. The Greek empire was much larger than the Roman Republic, but Rome was starting to gain power. And so the treaty that they had with Rome at that point in time, you would send the second in line to Rome to be a political prisoner, kind of a prisoner in velvet handcuffs. And so he spent a lot of his life in Rome as a political prisoner of the Romans. Well, his father died, so his brother became the king. So they turned him loose because it was always the second son of the king that went to Rome in this treaty. So his brother's oldest son, the next in line for the crown, or his brother's second son, went to Rome. So as it so happens, his brother dies. He murders his nephew, and gains a foothold into the throne. So he's taken someone else's power, and then he used the Romans. Because he had these connections in Rome, he used his Roman connections to get put in the Greek throne. So he uses politics, he uses murder, he uses just all these different ways to get in the throne.
I've lost while we're talking about him.
So he is the Greek little horn.
Oh.
He is. Becky got lost.
I lost while we were even talking about him.
Antiochus Epiphanes is this little horn from the Greek goat. And the reason why he's in here is because he is going to be an absolute terror to the Jewish people. He's going to, as soon as he takes possession of the Greek crown, he's going to start building the empire. The Greek empire was kind of on its way down at this point in time. He decides he's going to build it up, and Israel just happens to be in between where he wants to go, and it's just in the middle of everything. It's in the middle of Syria, which is a prosperous land. It's in his way to get to Egypt, and so he goes in, and for years these Jewish people have really, really, really been enjoying the benefits of being allies of the Greeks. And you'll see a little farther on down, it says that because of the rebellion, the rebels have reached the full measure of their sin. Those rebels that he's talking about are not the Greeks. They're the Jews. The Jewish people have intermingled the Greek customs so much so that they're starting to look Greek. They're starting to worship Greek gods. They're starting to take on Greek views. They're building gymnasiums. Now, gymnasiums by themselves are not bad things. It's like everything else. It's how you approach it. So The Greek men, we've all seen the statues of the Greeks, and they're throwing a discus, or they're doing some kind of Olympic sport, and they're naked. So the men would hold the Olympic sports, or they would work out in the gymnasiums naked. The Jewish men would actually have a small surgery to undo their circumcision, to make themselves look Greek, so they could go work out in the Greek gymnasiums with these men. And basically what they're doing is casting aside their Jewish heritage. That was a sign of their heritage with God. So these men and these people, they've rebelled against God, and God says, their full measure of sin has come. Now, if you look back in Genesis chapter 17, you'll see the same thing. When God's making his covenant with Abraham, God tells Abraham that he's not yet going to let him inherit the kingdom of Canaan, because the full iniquity of the Amorites has not come. So God does have a line that he will say, you've crossed this line. And that's what happens. And Antiochus Epiphanes is what happens. So it's just the same thing that happens in our lives. He uses the same thing that we've come accustomed to, that we've sold ourselves out to exact his wrath upon him. So now, is all these different things that it talks about here, the 2,300 days, the 6 years and 4 months, all this begins in 170 BC with the murder of the rightful high priest it's actually commissioned by the corrupt high priest that Antiochus brings in, who is bringing in all these pagan rituals and all these pagan elements into the Jewish worship. And so he has the rightful high priest murdered in 170 BC. And all this lasts until 164 BC, at the time of Antiochus Epiphanes' deaths. Sorry, lost my place. So at this point in time, if you look at the book of 1st and 2nd Maccabees, especially 1st Maccabees, you will see that paganism has gone into every bit of the Jewish culture. And Antiochus Epiphanes is fine and dandy. He is good with the Jewish people as long as they are casting aside God and they're turning towards his gods and worshiping him and doing all these things. But what happens is, eventually there's a breaking straw, and there's a breaking point in this. And there's a man called Judas Maccabeus. And basically his name translates out to, in English, it would be the Hammer of Judah. And he is the son of a priest. And his father basically sees enough and is enough. And every person in Israel they're ordered to make a sacrifice to the pagan gods. Judas Maccabeus, his father, sees this going on, and finally he can't stand it anymore, and he kills the priest and 2 Greeks who are conducting these ceremonies, and heads for the hills. This starts the Maccabean revolt in the Jewish history. At this point in time, Antiochus shows his full colors. He kills somewhere upwards of 80,000 men, women, children. He destroys the altar of God in the temple, tears it down, builds an altar to Zeus there, and sacrifices a pig on the altar to himself. Woo! Yeah, this guy thinks a whole lot of himself. So all these things that we see here, where it says that he's ruthless, gains the power of the throne through intrigue. He does all those things to get the throne. That he causes outrageous destruction, that he throws down the sacrifice for 2,300 days. He fights against the Prince of God and all these different things. Antiochus fits the bill. If you go back and look at secular history, he wages a lot of wars, but it's like no matter what, he has his thumb. He can't get Judea out of his mind, and there's always something in his history. He persecutes the Jews. He may wage war against someone else. But once the war is done, they're conquered people. All he wants from them is taxes and tithes. From the Jewish people, he just wants blood and vengeance. But it says here that he will not be destroyed by by the hands of men. Now, God will only let someone go so far. God has a line that he draws in the sand. By the way, that whole line in the sand thing, That comes from what Rome said to Antiochus. They told him he could go so far, no more, and if he stepped across that line, then he would have the Roman Empire against, or the Roman Republic against him. Different story for a different time. But that's where we get draw the line in the sand from. Anyway, worthless trivia. And my wife makes faces at me again. Anyway, so the Bible says that he will not die by the hands of men. And you would think somebody who's been in as many battles, led as many battles, and just basically, stabbed people in the back to get where he's at, he would have plenty of enemies that someone would assassinate him, which was or he would die in battle, which was very common for kings in those days. But instead, if we look at 2 Maccabees chapter 9, it says that after he received word that Judas Maccabeus' forces had defeated him in Jerusalem and freed Jerusalem, he really decided enough's enough. I'm going down there again, and I'm going to wipe them completely off the map. And on the way to Judea, all of a sudden, he stops and falls off of the back of his chariot in immense pain, writhing. And he spends the last few days of his life visibly being eaten by worms and in intense pain. Like the worst case of parasites that you've ever seen. And I meant to write down the reference here in the link, and I'm sorry I didn't, but I believe it's the Gospel of John, where the writer of the Gospel relates that King Herod, Agrippa, I think it was, had something very similar happen to him when he proclaimed that he was not a man but God. So that is a common way that God strikes men down, apparently, in the intertestamental and New Testament period. Now, that was written from a Jewish standpoint. So we would expect to hear from a Jewish historian say that yes, this happened and that God struck this man down. So there's also a contemporary of Antiochus named Polybus. And now he recorded history as it happened during his time. He's not one of these guys who wrote history, looked back and looked at ancient records and wrote out. This guy was a contemporary of Antiochus and wrote history as it was happening. This is a Greek who has no connection to the Jews, who is writing about the king of his time, and he says that the Greek king Antiochus Epiphanes died, and I quote, owing to certain manifestations of divine displeasure. In English, that would be God struck him down, or a divine power struck him down. That's a Greek historian writing that down. So basically, that's what we have here is this whole chapter here. It does talk about the Medo-Persians. It does talk about Alexander the Great. But this is really about a forerunner of the Antichrist. We're going to see later on that God will give Daniel another vision. And it will start off talking really solidly about giving a really big history lesson on what's going to happen in this intertestamental period of time with the Greeks and the Jews. And then it's going to fade into the Antichrist. So a lot of the things that we see here in Antiochus Epiphanes, like the abomination of desolation, all these things being, tormenting the Jews, setting himself up as God in the temple, all these things are going to be illusions that we're also going to see in the Antichrist. This is the Jewish people's warning from God. This is what it's going to be like. This is how they are going to know. Because remember, we saw in Revelation, we studied here a few weeks ago, we're going to have 144,000 Jews that are going to be evangelists. The Jewish nation is going to turn back to God. They're going to look at this, they're going to see it, and they're going to realize it. So, now, I'm sorry about the notes. They're not great this week. I was just really busy, just to be honest with you. I thought I had everything planned out, so the notes are not near as good as I wanted them to be. But anyway, so that's Antiochus Epiphanes, the little horn. Not the Antichrist, but a forerunner of the Antichrist.